How's it going, people? Tactard Ted. It is Thursday, 15th of September. What's happening, folks? Hope your work week is getting along successfully, that you're having all the happiness that you want in your life. Speaking of work, it may come as a surprise to you, someone as opinionated as I am, is also a professional. And at my work, I do not engage in political discussion. It's not conducive to what I do. Probably one of the reasons why you see me making videos is this is a way for me to deal with a lot of my beliefs or a lot of things that I want to discuss that I can't do so on a daily basis without causing issues. So, let me clue you in on a little conversation I had last night. Now, last night I was busy. I had a lot going on. Had to engage law enforcement a couple of times to resolve some situations that were occurring. Anyhow, I got into a discussion with a gentleman who was Ukrainian. And of course, I did not bring up the war. I did not touch that subject. Why? Because there's no sense with me being in a position where I have to deal and talk with people to immediately piss people off because they don't agree with me or I don't agree with them. No need for it. But I had an interesting conversation. I took one side. I didn't take one side or the other. This conversation, this gentleman was from Lviv or Lvov, depending on how you want to pronounce it. The old way, the new way, however. And it was quite interesting. His interpretation of history was totally different than the norm or most things that I've read. And it became apparent within 10 to 15 minutes that this guy was had a lot of prejudices about himself and about how he viewed history. And he went on, he says, the Russians say they're Rus, from the Kievan Rus. They're not Rus. I'm Rus. I'm a real Rus. They're not Rus. No. They're lost people who wandered over to the east, and then the Mongols and the Tartars, they come and fuck their women, and this is why they look like this. And then, of course, within a couple of seconds, came the word Yevrey. For those of you who don't говорю по-русски, Yevrey is Russian for Jew. And, everybody knows about the anti-Semitism during the 30s in Germany, 30s and 40s. Not too many people want to talk about the rampant anti-Semitism in Eastern Europe. It's ingrained in the culture. The pogroms under the Tsar. And it's just not Russians. Very much Ukrainians, very much Poles. It's interesting. There's not a big deal made about the gypsies, but there's also a fair amount of prejudice in that part of the world against gypsies. It's just what it is. It's their culture. I get it. Doesn't mean I have to agree with it. Doesn't mean you have to agree with it. But this guy, it's hard today in our culture to be able to distinguish between pride in who you are and xenophobia. And I'm not even kidding. It's like there are lots of jokes out there about what do you call I'm proud of being black, said the black man. I'm proud of being Hispanic, said the Latino. I'm proud of being Chinese, said the Asian. And I'm proud of being a WASP or a white man, said the racist. So sometimes that's not too far off the mark. It really isn't. But it's hard to determine how much of this was pride in himself and how much of it was just out and out xenophobic racism. And it's interesting for me. A lot of things are interesting for me. That seems to be one of my phrases I keep putting out there. Back during the time in the military, in the 80s and the 90s, it was the capitalist world versus the communist world. And we're all told, look, those people are good people. They're not so different from us. It's just that communism oppresses them. And communism will oppress us if it's given an opportunity. So therefore, we need to be vigilant against communism. Well, communism went away in 91 and the Soviet Union fell apart. Now, it wasn't just it was a 2-year process. It started in 89 in Poland and East Germany, Romania, and eventually spread to the Baltics, being granted permission to leave the Soviet Union, to the total collapse of the Soviet Union. In fact, the last Soviet republic to be part of the Soviet Union was Kazakhstan. It's really interesting that Kazakhstan was the de facto capital of the Soviet Union for probably 2 or 3 days before they exited the Union. They were the only member, but they exited. So we got rid of communism, or those states gave up communism, and that should be the end. We lived happily ever after. That's not the case. We're talking from 91 to 22. We got along. We coexisted. I visited the region. I've worked in that part of the world. I've been to a lot of the countries that were formerly Soviet republics. Winds of change, scorpions, that sort of thing. It was a rebirth of Europe and how Europe would and the world situation was going to be. And unfortunately now we've allowed, once we got rid of the problem between communism and capitalism that existed between 1923 and 1991, once that was all out of the way, what happens? The older prejudices start to come back in. Jews, gypsies, Russians, Ukrainians, all the old divisions, all the old divisiveness rolls back in. And as bad as communism was, at least the communist dictators did manage to keep a lid on all that. There's no better example, if you want to go it on a micro scale, is what happened with Yugoslavia. When Yugoslavia broke up, all these little regions immediately went back to hating the way they hated before communism. Hating this neighbor for this reason, hating that neighbor for the other reason. Balkan Wars, all sorts of little wars. Sarajevo, Bosnia, Croatia, Kosovo, all these problems exploded, and they're all based on old ideas of ethnic tensions or ethnic biases. And I thought we were done with all that. I thought the big problem in the world was communism. And don't get me wrong, I'm not downgrading communism. I'm an anti-communist. I make no bones about that. But for me, it's kind of a waste. All the time, all the effort that was spent in the Cold War, and that great feeling in the 90s, at least for the West, that the Cold War was over, that there had been a resolution reached. That was great. That was absolutely great. I will say that it wasn't so great for a lot of the folks in Eastern Europe and Russia and some of the former republics, because they had a new reality. They had a lot more difficulties. They had to change their entire system of living. And of course, we felt within time that they would adapt, that everything would be okay. I think what I didn't realize is how differently we treated those countries. Honestly, if we had really believed that communism was the only problem, why didn't we reach out and elevate Russia? Why didn't we reach out and elevate a lot of these areas? Why didn't we bring them along? No, instead, we treat them as vanquished enemies in a war, and we don't help them, and we meddle continuously. We meddle and we exploit them. Now, some of the exploitation was in the guise of investment. Other exploitations, like how we basically ensured that Boris Yeltsin got elected a second time, that was just out and out interference. We love to point out we don't want anybody interfering in our elections, but we have no problems interfering in Russian elections, El Salvadoran elections, Venezuelan elections, Israeli elections. We got no issues with that. We'll do it. We'll do it left and right. But boy, don't you mess with our elections. I'm really concerned. I'm really concerned because as a guy who loves my country and believes in my country, I really think that we're down the wrong path when you are hypocritical all the time and you don't understand that individual nations have their rights to their beliefs and have the right to engage in their own security of their nation. You got an issue. But I digress. Back to this Ukrainian guy. He, had absolute faith that he was right. Now, his version of history was what we used to call historical revisionism. I'm not sure that it's historically revision or if that's just the only version of history he's been taught. But it doesn't match up with what I've read in various books. It doesn't match up with the education I've received. Instead, it matches up to the sort of thing that we heard from the ideology of Germany in the 30s. They're superior. Those who are east of them are inferior. And they don't have a right to exist. Sprinkled in with other groups that also occupy the territory. And I think it's interesting, we don't really talk, I'm guessing that the gypsies are such a minority nowadays that we don't even really discuss persecution or bias against gypsies. And, it's interesting. Here in this country, poor people, all colors, congregate together. They do. In one neighborhood, you'll find poor people, and a lot of times you will find poor people of different races live in the same block. Poor people in Russia, or people who are not necessarily well off, have their own villages for the most part. There's a little integration, but not much. In Siberia, you can go down the road and you can see a wooden church with a crescent moon on the top. Muslim, probably Tartars. And that's a Tartar village. And most of the people, if not all, unless there's been some intermarriage or what have you, are Tartars. Next village down the road, Russian village. And it's a Russian village. There are no Tartars unless somebody's married a Tartar. There are no Tartars there. Another ways down the road, a gypsy village. And the interesting, I was told once, and I don't know how true it is, but a Russian I was traveling with one time pointed to it and says, "Yep, those are gypsies." And I'm like, in that town. I'm like, "You're just seeing buildings. How do you know those are gypsies? I'm curious." And he goes, "Well," he says, "there are no stockades around the house. In the country, Russian houses are usually a fence or a stockade, and it's 8-10 feet tall. You just don't easily see over the surround the courtyard of the house, and everything is fenced in. No prying eyes. There's a fence." And he said, "No, gypsies don't do that. And Russians do that. Gypsies don't do that." And I took that verbatim. That was the only experience of that I can tell. But I just so much aggravation with me that a lot of what we're seeing today, the Russophobia, and I do believe Russophobia is a thing. It exists. It's real. And people don't want to let go of their hatred that's existed for a couple hundred years. And I guess it shouldn't be surprising, because we have people that won't let go of their hatred from events from 150, 200 years ago in this country. In fact, now it's interesting that a lot of the tensions that were going away have been inflamed within the last 20 years. And I'm really now wondering if all these tensions just ebb and flow. If the situation doesn't get better for a while, and then somebody decides to inflame them, or if this is just a natural course of things. Being in my 50s, I've seen race relations in this country be a lot better. I'm watching them get worse. It just, for me, I watched the end of the Cold War. Now I'm seeing a new Cold War. And I'm seeing arguments that were made 30, 40 years ago being reversed in the opposite direction. The stance of Western Europe and the Americans. Free travel is a human right. And they used to bang on the Soviet Union for this all the time, because the Soviets didn't let their people go out and travel a lot. That's a human right. You're violating human rights. That is a human right to be able to travel. Now, the EU is saying they want to ban Russians from entering the EU on travel. What happened to that human right? How come it was a human right 30, 40 years ago, and now it's not a human right? Just the same as it was a big deal when there were trade deals or situations where Russia or the Soviet Union, brought McDonald's to Moscow. That was a big deal. Pepsi-Cola went in early because Khrushchev liked Pepsi. Coca-Cola went in. It was a big deal. And now it's not a big deal. It's not a big deal. We want our companies out of there. We're going to put pressure on them. We put pressure on McDonald's. McDonald's is left. Coca-Cola supposedly left, although I still see Coke on Russian store shelves from videos I see from friends. It's all interesting for me. And as I predicted early on, a lot of businesses are secretly moving back in. IKEA is a good one. IKEA is one of those companies out of Sweden that said, "We're leaving, we're done, we're gone." But what they didn't tell you is Mega, which is their brand of malls, or it's a mall chain that's owned by IKEA, still maintain operations inside Russia. And but the IKEA name store is closed. Now the reopening. Sweden and IKEA has decided that they don't want to take the hit. And there are American companies that are not being resistant. Lay's potato chips. You can still buy Lay's in Russia. They still exist. Some companies are not going to pull out of the markets. They don't see any wisdom in bowing to political pressure to harm their bottom line. You know, this is part of the problem here. We have businesses. We demand that businesses do things that are not in their best interest to keep their popularity at home. And it's a bad deal that the government has so much sway over these businesses that if you don't bow to a little bit of pressure because we would like you to do something, now we're not going to litigate it. We're not going to make a rule that you can't do business with Russia. But if you don't, we're going to make other rules to basically coerce you into doing it. We'll cause you pain where you don't have pain on a different front. And it's a lot of arm twisting going on with this. And why? Well, we have to appease people like this guy from Lvov, who hates Russians with every fiber of his being. And you could tell it wasn't anything new. He hated Russians before this. And he's the one who brought up Bandera. I just basically listened to what he said, ask a few questions, because I'm not trying to get into a shitstorm with him or an arguing match. And for me, it was very enlightening to actually have somebody in their own words tell you what you hear coming from other people. And this guy is not in Ukraine. He is working here. He is working here. And he goes out of his way. He's not interested in coexisting with anybody. He says, and every Russian I meet, I tell them their country's going to lose. My country's going to win because they're weak. They're not really Russians. They're not really Ruski. And Ruski is what the Russians, that's their name for Russian, Ruski. I'm really a Rus. I'm really a Rus. They're not. No, they're not even, they're barely even human. And I'm like, are you serious, dude? Is what I'm thinking. I just didn't make any comments. But it's really enlightening to see this nonsense. And don't get me wrong, I'm sure there are xenophobes in Russia, but I don't see the xenophobes in Russia currently killing their neighbors because their neighbors aren't who they are. I don't see in Siberia, I don't see the Russians going down the road and killing the Tartars or the Gypsies because their Tartars are Gypsies. I do see the Ukrainian government and the Ukrainian army and groups like Right Sector going in and killing Russians, ethnic Russians, in their villages because they hate them. They can't stand that they speak Russian. They can't stand, which is also interesting because a lot of the videos coming out of Ukrainian units trying to send messages to Zelensky or whatever about how they're being abused and used as cannon fodder, and they're refusing to carry out orders until they get more supplies. Oftentimes these guys will stop mid-sentence and ask in Russian, how do you say this in Ukrainian? Because they don't speak Ukrainian, some of them, as a natural language. But they are being forced to speak Ukrainian or come under the ire. It would be the same. It's no different than if we passed a law tomorrow saying that nobody can speak Spanish in public. You can't speak Spanish in public. That would be wrong. You can't speak Spanish in public. Can you imagine what kind of a shitstorm there would be in this country? All the charges of racism, all the various comments about being xenophobic, and how the government was just being terribly unfair to folks. Well, that's what we're supporting. We're supporting a government who makes laws that you can only speak this language in public. In public. That you can't teach this language in schools. Last I checked, most high schools in this country have Spanish classes. And French and probably Latin. I don't know that German is taught anymore. One of my great things that pissed me off in school was when I was ready to choose a language, they deleted the German class. So you have to try to teach yourself a little and try to pick up what you can. And to be honest, I don't even hardly use it anymore. But I digress, folks. I just thought I would throw that out there. It was enlightening for me. And it confirmed a lot of things you hear, and you sometimes I got to look at some of these things. Some of the things we hear about how people act and how people treat other people seem so beyond the pale. They seem so much not like human beings treat each other. And I will tell you, I lean towards freedom, but I'm also very conservative in a lot of ideas. I treat people with respect. I don't have to agree with them, but I treat everybody with respect. Until you want to argue and you want to go that way, then yeah, I'll argue and I'll probably say a lot of things you don't like. People mistake being honest with being confrontational. Sometimes the truth is confrontational. It's not why I deal in the truth. Dealing in the truth is a lot easier than dealing in a lie. So anyhow, folks, a long overtime, second video of the day. The last one I did was about 2 o'clock this morning. Hopefully I'll get this one uploaded by the time I get off work. Anyhow, folks, y'all take care. Have a great day, and be yourself, man. Bye.